Hello everyone and welcome to the Money and Metals Network Coin Talk. My name is Campbell and today I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Rory Naismith, a distinguished scholar in early medieval English history, currently serving as a professor at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of Corpus Christi College. Professor Naismith's research focuses on the economic and social developments of Anglo-Saxon England, with a particular interest in the integration of material and written sources, including coinage. He is the author of several notable works, including Early Medieval Britain circa 500 to 1000, Citadel of the Saxons, The Rise of Early London, and Money and Power in Anglo-Saxon England, The Southern English Kingdoms, 757 to 865. His most recent book was published last year in 2023, Making Money in the Early Middle Ages, and is presumably forming the foundations for today's talk. As usual, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat, and Professor Naismith and I will go through them together at the end. So without further ado, I will pass over to Professor Naismith.
Thank you very much indeed, Campbell. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and thanks to all of you out there on the web for tuning in. Now, early medieval money has had a bad rap. It plays the role of feeble and primitive foil to the dynamic monetary economies of the Roman period on one side and of the commercial revolution of the 13th century on the other. And in many ways, that poor reputation is understandable. In the period between the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe in the 5th century and the 12th century, there was a lot less money around in terms of circulating coin. That is the conclusion drawn by historians and archaeologists working across much of the former Western Roman Empire, and it is pretty inescapable. At the archaeological site of San Genesio in Pisa, where about 2,000 square meters from the late 12th century, where about 2,000 square meters have been excavated, some 240 Roman coins were found and 170 from the late 12th century and after, compared with 2 from the early Middle Ages. Similar figures could be cited from across Italy and France. The change can be quantified on a larger scale for England and Wales based on the portable antiquities scheme and the coinage corpus of early medieval coin finds. It is only as comprehensive as the energy and goodwill of finders allow, but these two databases provide a good guide to the big picture. Crucially, the Portable Antiquities Scheme and EMC focus on single finds thought to have been lost individually, not just on hoards that were buried together. And if one compares the total numbers of coins found from the Roman period, from the early Middle Ages and from the later Middle Ages, the latter taken as running down to 1500, the figures speak loudly and clearly. People lost an average of nearly 700 recorded coins per year across the Roman period and 177 per year for the later Middle Ages. For the early medieval period, the figure is under 9, fewer than the equivalent of 9 recorded finds of coins per year from the 5th century to the 11th, and these are also heavily concentrated in the decades around 700 and then after about 950. Now, that is not a promising start. And we go from bad to worse on turning to the basic versatility of early medieval currency. Roman coinage included a large base metal element that served as small change, and there were also low-value silver and bullion coins in the later Middle Ages. That was generally not the case in the early medieval period. In the 5th to 11th to 7th centuries, gold coins reigned supreme, preserving the top end of the denominational structure of the later Roman Empire, but no longer consistently supported by lower value components of copper alloy and small silver coins. Silver did come back onto the menu from the late 7th century, when silver pennies took over the mantle of the dominant denomination and gradually spread to become the main currency everywhere from Rome to Barcelona, as well as in Budapest, Dublin and Sweden. These were somewhat lower in value than the earlier gold pieces, but still the gold-silver ratio was typically about 12 or 14 to 1. So they're still, but these coins are far from low value in real terms. They're still quite valuable. Charlemagne in 794 stipulated the maximum price that could be charged for bread was a dozen 2-pound wheat loaves for 1 denarius, 1 penny. This was not quite a monodenominational currency, but there were small numbers of halfpennies or obols in circulation, and even smaller numbers of large gold coins. But it was very narrowly focused on a mid-value denomination. People just had to spend their pennies as best they could, be they inconveniently high in value for the poor or inconveniently low in value for the wealthy. All this is important to recognize as a point of departure. My interest is in talking about the issue in a different way. Yes, the scale of coined money was limited, but there were always some coins being made and always some coins being used in most of early medieval Western Europe. The question is, at a time when most people must have been comfortable doing without coined money, and it was often not easy to come by, why did they make or use it at all? What kind of pressures, desires, or situations prompted them to turn to coined money, and with what associations or effects? I believe that what emerges in the early Middle Ages is a very interesting kind of monetary economy, one that was functionally diverse yet still embedded in many kinds of social relation, taking advantage of a consistent yet constrained currency. Coined coins, as it were, became a way of reifying value in any setting where what was being handed over, often in a public or performative setting, was meaningful, regardless of whether it was a purchase, a rent, a gift, or whatever. You want to make a point of using the coins. At the same time, there were deep tensions created by coined money because of imbalances in access and distribution. This was most pronounced at the point of production. Circulation could work rather differently, and it could be a good indicator of economic complexity with implications about the nature of demand. In what follows, I'll go through some of the major patterns that can be seen in relation to the making and use of coins. But one first preliminary issue: money is not just coin. It is most fundamentally a consensus on measuring value manifested in common units of account. In this conceptual sense, virtually all of early medieval Europe was highly monetized, including places like pre-Viking Ireland and 10th century northern Iberia, where hardly any coins circulated. This is an important point not to lose sight of. Most people were accustomed to thinking in quantitative monetary terms, even if they did not count out actual coins. One consequence of this is that when charters or narratives from this period mention, say, a denarius, it is often difficult to tell whether they mean a silver coin or just a measure of value equivalent to one. Another consequence is that we need to be very careful of dismissing periods or societies because coin was scarce. You could, in early medieval Europe, have relatively complex economic systems, even very commercialized ones, with minimal coined money. The opposite, lots of coins without complex exchange systems, is also theoretically possible, but as we'll see, less likely. One consequence of this is that we need to be very careful about the term monetization. It can mean two things. One is what I've just described, the general spread of thought in terms of money. Another, the one economic historians usually have in mind, is use of actual specie. Monetization of this kind has often been deployed as a blunt instrument, which Michael Poston diagnosed as an analytical deus ex machina that could be invoked to explain pretty much whatever one wanted. If the straitened early Middle Ages can teach scholars of monetary history one thing, it is that you could have plenty of quantification and monetary thought without much coin, and also that coined money did not just happen organically. It emerges from specific circumstances, and different segments of society engaged with it in their own distinct ways. Today, I'll focus largely on actual coined money, with particular reference to why coins were made and why they were used. These two parts of a coin's lifespan may have had little, if any, direct connection and served quite different economic roles. To try and distinguish them, I will refer to anything that directly caused or resulted from production of coin as primary circulation, and all use subsequent to that as secondary circulation. There is a significant schematic element here. I'm looking at broader pictures and models, which I will situate with reference to specific examples, but with the general caveat that large patterns always had their own local texture. Okay then, making coins. It's actually extremely difficult to pinpoint the processes and pressures that led to the making of coins, a fact that applies even in antiquity and the later Middle Ages. As the points about conceptual money highlight, coins were not really needed, but they were invested with strong symbolic resonances and were desirable and convenient for certain constituencies and purposes. These generally revolved around state structures, elites, or both. Broader commercial demand may have been a major factor in the later Middle Ages, but probably not in most cases before the 12th century. For analytical purposes, it is possible to propose three relevant models, one in which coins are made for state expenditure, one in which coins are made for state income, and one in which coins are made in a more personalized, localized, and direct interchange of diverse and direct needs. The first of these, state expenditure, means a situation in which most coins are made and put into circulation through direct and usually relatively centralized state action. It is the classic model for big polities with taxes and salaries for at least some of the army and bureaucracy. The later Roman Empire, from about 300 to 500, is a good example, though so too is its later Byzantine incarnation, as well as many Islamic states. In the Roman case, the cycle begins with coins being made for paying soldiers and officials. These would then percolate out into wider circulation, and some would be sucked back in by the imperial administration when taxes were demanded in cash. Those taxes would then be consolidated and passed on to a select few centres for reminting alongside fresh bullion from mines, at which point the cycle would begin again. I am simplifying things a bit here, but consensus seems to be that something like this scheme was at work. Elements of it are mentioned in various pieces of legislation collected together under Theodosius II and Justinian, and also occasionally in narrative texts. There are also well-known passages in John Lydus and Procopius about the dire consequences of the imperial postal service being scaled back in Anatolia, with the consequence that landowners could no longer sell their crops to representatives of the state to get the gold they needed to pay their taxes. The whole situation was bad and left both the imperial administration and its subjects suffering. Behind this lay what was clearly a large and structured administrative machinery. There were normally only about a dozen or fewer places minting coins in the whole empire at this time. All represented large quasi-industrial operations and their distribution depended more on administrative geography than commerce or population. The rich provinces of Egypt and North Africa were generally without mints, for example, while the four clustered around the Sea of Marmara represented the confluence of four provinces. The number of mints was even smaller for gold coinage, which from the late 4th century was often made at just one place within each emperor's territory. Tellingly, gold and silver fell under the jurisdiction of a separate section of the Roman bureaucracy to the base metal coinage. Gold was by far the most prestigious element of the currency. Figures of any status received payments in the form of gold coins and silver plate, as did the mass of the army at occasional payments known as donatives. Some, but by no means all, late Roman gold coins carried inscriptions saying they were made precisely for distribution in these circumstances. Much later, Luprand of Cremona described a ceremonial distribution of salaries to 10th century Byzantine officials, in which gold pieces in sealed sacks were given out in the presence of the emperor. Something similar was done with gold dinars in Fatimid Cairo. These were offerings that sat somewhere on a continuum between payment and gift, with a high degree of ceremonial essential to their first transfer from rulers to valued subjects. Neither Luprand nor the Fatimid or late Roman sources explicitly say what coins given out in this way that coins given out in this way were freshly minted, but given the context, it is entirely plausible that they were. It is worth stressing that ritualized settings like this may have been a major cause for making high-value coins. There was not necessarily a more mundane monetary economy lurking behind the scenes. Ritual, economy, and the state were closely intertwined. This is not to say that state taxes and payouts dominated without exception. A set of laws from the 360s and 370s shows that some people had been trying to use Roman minting facilities to get their own private gold turned into solidi. At first, the emperor flat out refused, but a few years later he relented and allowed the minting to go ahead with a hefty rate of 25% of the gold going into state coffers. The importance of this is that it implies demand for minting for private purposes, which foreshadows the more direct role of local elites in minting that would be important in later times. The second major kind of relationship between minting and the rest of society was characterized by what I'll call state income. Here, the state and its fiscal processes remained the major force behind minting, but the onus fell on those who owed payments to the state, so that instead of having mints apparently handling coins for expenditure, they instead mostly focused on coins for state income. A model of this kind tended to be found in polities with a firm idea of fiscal extraction as a right or power on the Roman model, but an increasingly limited role for that resource as an actual prop of government. That is to say, there tended to be some sort of taxation system, but not a standing salaried army. Another important change is that regions where state income was a key force in minting typically had more numerous mint places, which hints at the dynamic behind this shift. Collection and transformation of income became a desirable thing, typically in the hands of local elites, who might well also be representatives of the state. More fragmented minting therefore reflects a changing nexus between local society, coined money, and state authority. I'll use as an example of this Merovingian Gaul between the late 6th century and about 751. It had at first a large coinage of gold tremises, replaced around 670 with silver denarii. Both are known from a vast number of mint places, especially the gold, for which at least 600 identifiable mints have been noted, with many more that cannot be localized and new ones turning up on a regular basis. These profuse mints were highly diverse in character. Some were cities, but most were vici, rural settlements that sat at the center of a local district. Jean-François Boyer has recently showed that many Merovingian vici mints were central places in structures of local power. Some re-emerge as centers of districts in later times, or were among the properties of elites mentioned in wills or other documents, like Ardin, which belonged to the Bishop of Le Mans, for example. Very little about these coins indicates why they were made. In many ways, they are resolutely local. Hardly any name the king. The norm was to give the name of the location and of the craftsman official responsible for manufacture. And the term usually used for that official is the moneyer. A few specify they were made for ratio ecclesiae or similar, for the tax account of the church. This is one hint that, at least in principle, the fiscal machinery of the kingdom played a part in calling these mint places into being. The only detailed account of how this might work in practice is a contentious passage in the life of St. Eligius, a 7th century bishop of Paris, who had also served as a moneyer and a goldsmith. It describes how a tax collector and a moneyer, it's not clear whether these are one and the same or two individuals, arrive to exact the census publicus, or general land tax, from the pagus or district around a place called Solignac near Limoges, where Eligius possessed an estate. The locals produced a mass of gold to settle this payment, but the miraculous element in the story was that it would not melt until Eligius himself showed up. Whether that means the tax itself should have gone to him, or just the right to gather and process it, is not clear. What can be said is that by this stage, the taking of tax involved gold coin, but was extracted on a very local basis, with an expectation that local elites would play a significant role in that process. We can turn all of this back onto the eye-popping map of Merovingian mint places and recognise that most of these would operate only briefly and occasionally, perhaps only once. It also makes sense of a surprising feature of Merovingian coinage, which is that even coins from small, short-lived mint places would often circulate far across the kingdom, and payment of tax is one plausible explanation for this. The murkiest part of the story here is what happened next. The Merovingian kings did not regularly pay out money to an army or network of bureaucrats, so the best guess is that their gold income was spent in other ways, on the royal household or on gifts to supporters and churches. Of course, this all assumes that everything minted in the localities went to the king. A big part of the success of the Merovingian monetary system was how its basic structures could be adapted to suit several interests. Local elites might seek immunity from the financial demands and jurisdictional interference of royal government, but they might equally buy enthusiastically into the raising of tax because it offered obvious potential for peculation. Gregory of Tours, writing at the end of the 6th century, has several stories that revolve around this, such as one about how the count and his deputy at Tours got into difficulties after borrowing against future income. For this reason, I am very hesitant to see the Merovingian coinage as evidence of a robust fiscal machine. It may have started out that way, but its persistence and success indicate local agencies buying into it for their own benefit. It is likely that by an early stage, only a limited proportion of the coins from each act of minting actually reach the king. Some whole coinages, for instance in areas covered by immunities, may never even have been intended for sending to the king at all. Now, this final possibility brings us to the last of my three schemes for how and why coins were made in early medieval Europe. One in which minting is still driven by direct interaction with patrons, but the demands of a centralized state recede and are replaced or outnumbered by more localized, personalized ones. Mints and moneyers might still have operated in the name of a king, and may well have paid some sort of fee or proportion of profits, but the key point is that the bulk of minting was no longer tied to either expenditure or income of a larger state structure. Some production might be driven by occasional recoinages, and some might stem from large-scale commodified movements of bullion, which tended to feed the major mint places in hubs of long-distance or cross-border exchange, such as Carolingian Dorstadt or late Anglo-Saxon London, where you had a lot of hustle and bustle, people coming and going over long distances. But even in both these scenarios, production came to depend more closely on private demand. Another way of putting this is that the primary circulation of coin became based on what had previously been the domain of secondary circulation, the two collapsing together. Coins would have been made for commercial activities, for the payment of rents, for the giving of gifts, and so on. The puzzle is when and why people would make new coins to do the job that old ones could have done perfectly well. Again, it is not enough just to think that coins are generally good and desirable. There needs to be some sort of need to mobilize the not insignificant resources that minting required, something that required coins specifically rather than plate or other commodities. We need therefore to think in this scenario not just of economic imperatives, but also social ones. This is partly a function of the small scale of the early medieval monetary economy, but it also reflects the dynamics of minting on this model. Production was relatively dispersed and dominated by elites, both in terms of jurisdiction and in terms of patronage. That is, of who actually brought in the gold or silver that fueled minting. Elites were likely the ones who kept most minting afloat, with larger, more predictable demand. Moneyers and mints could well have made coin for others as well, but they are likely to have done so on the back of elite demand. I'll illustrate with an example from Carolingian Francia. Now, the passage of text here comes from one of the first written grants of minting privileges issued by Charles the Bold in favour of the Cathedral of Châlons en Champagne in 865. It says that the church has been given this power because they could not otherwise obtain coin without considerable trouble. The implication is that, at least as far as Charles and the bishop believed, establishing a mint in Châlons would enable them to create coins for their own needs whenever they required. Elsewhere, it is possible to see that such needs might include gifts, rents, land purchases, and commerce, all of which could drive minting. The underlying problem in Carolingian Francia, in late Anglo-Saxon England, in 10th and 11th century Germany and Italy, is that virtually never does anyone say why specific batches of coin were made. At best, it is assumed that moneyers were there to supply coin if it was needed and could not be sourced through other channels. As at Châlons, this is in fact the reasoning given in some Carolingian and German diplomas for setting up a mint in the first place. Okay, so these are my three general schemes for how and why coins were made. They were not mutually exclusive. A degree of elite demand existed already in the late Roman period. Some coin issues in Merovingian Francia, Visigothic Iberia, and elsewhere probably represent royal expenditure for specific and substantial needs, like one-off army payments. And in Carolingian Francia and late Anglo-Saxon England, pressures that pulled patrons to mint coins sometimes included royally mandated tributes to Viking invaders. The point is to emphasize the prevailing source of demand. The main caveat, however, is that all three of these models look only at a part of the lifespan of coins in circulation: production and the steps that immediately preceded or ensued. That's to say primary circulation, as I called it before. And it leaves to one side everything that came next, secondary circulation, which brings us to the essential tensions in the monetary system of the period. The basic problem is one I've already mentioned, the relatively restricted size and versatility of the monetary economy. But what follows from this, even if it is less immediately obvious, is that the limited resources would have been distributed very unevenly. Elites dominated production and primary circulation and sat on comparatively large reserves of cash. Indirectly, they therefore played a large role in the shape of secondary circulation too. All of this meant that the bulk of the population had an even smaller pool of coin to use, and because dealing in cash often meant dealing with the elite or their close allies, they entered at a significant disadvantage. In 829, a gathering of bishops at Paris expressed concern at this and other problems that beset the rural economy. They lamented how both ecclesiastical and secular lords would beat anyone who refused to accept their prices at market. They complained about tactics used to exploit desperate peasants during famines, for instance, selling stockpiles of grain at the current inflated price and then asking the peasants to pay the same amount back at harvest time when the price of grain had plummeted. There is little doubt that tactics like these were commonplace in the early Middle Ages, yet they are rarely confronted as directly as this. That is because the emphasis generally fell on coin as an expression of solidarity and even equity. As Jonas of Orleans, who wrote up the decrees from Paris in 829, put it, lords and peasants alike should be able to engage smoothly in what he called the willing compact of buyer and seller. He does not explicitly refer to coin, I should say, but coin certainly would fit very well into both these roles. Now, to use coin was to participate in what was conceived of as a grand consensus, one that united the people of a given kingdom. This was why moralizing rulers like Charlemagne, his son Louis the Pious, Edgar in England, and then Edgar's son Ethelred II reformed their coinages as a demonstrative statement of cleansing and restoring that could be seen and appreciated by the whole populace. It was also why, on a much smaller scale, people made a point of using coins in exchanges with a public, performative character. In such settings, coins provided a metonym for value that all could see and understand. They were used in rituals of both manumission and autodidaction, that is, giving oneself into slavery. A wonderful illustration of the valence of handing over coin comes from a Tuscan placitum of 803. It concerns a priest called Alpulo who risked everything to be with a nun called Gumperga. At one point in the account of the case given by Alpulo to the court, Gumperga had been taken from his house back to her nunnery. But the amorous priest was not to be stopped. In the night, he rode to the nunnery and met Gumperga at what must have been a pre-planned rendezvous. A wonderfully vivid touch is that Alpulo had to stand up on his horse to lift Gumperga over the wall. This is where the romance comes in, and I choose to imagine it looking something like this. Alpulo kissed Gumperga and handed her a few coins, 2 solidi, which he described as an ara, or pledge, meaning a statement of intent to marry. The priest then rode off again, perhaps warmed by an inner glow, though in the event neither party was to have the time of their life. Alpulo's 2 appeals against an unfavourable judgment were upheld, and as far as we know, he and Gumperga were not to be reunited. Using coin could then be both assertive and emancipatory, and also coercive and exploitative. Crucially, monetary transactions were backed up with the full weight of legal and social structures. No hard incentive attached to using coins, except insofar as they were demanded by parties able to assert their will. But there was most definitely a penalty for refusing to use them when offered. This was typically a fine or a public beating, according to some Carolingian laws. One short text issued by Charles the Bald in 861 dealt with a specific incident of refusing good coin, though frustratingly it does not say where, and it then gives instructions for the missi Charles sent to deal with this affront. They were to be merciful and take into account factors like hardship, status, and even gender, and the capitulary indicates that low-status women may have been the culprits here. Nonetheless, repeat offenders would be punished by being burned in the face with the coins that they had rejected. The refusal of coin that Charles and his men were so keen to nip in the bud was probably less a judgment on the quality of Charles's coinage, though at this stage it was very inconsistent, and more a sign of the unequal and disadvantageous interactions that coin involved. Challenging the reliability of the coins themselves, which this text suggests was a strategy used by groups below the elite, was one of very few options left open. We should be in no doubt that money and access to it were some of the variables that resulted from and played into subtle social differentiations. Village-level elites who had ties to external, higher elites in their social networks may well have been in touch with moneyers or mints, giving them a direct line to fresh coinage, and they could then channel this to neighbours in a village setting, or take advantage of it to enhance their spending power in markets or in buying land. A wide range of people would have had some contact with secondary circulation of coin, again probably via markets, and here the level of involvement and access did not necessarily correlate with other markers of rank or status. Those with more land may have relied less on the market, while those with less land depended more on work as artisans or wage labourers, so may in fact have been relatively richer in cash. This could be seen as both a good thing and a bad thing. It reflects a higher level of economic complexity and a greater degree of autonomy, as Georg Simmel emphasised in relation to industrialised societies. But in a peasant context, market dependence may have been seen as second best, and it brought a higher level of risk, reliant as it was on so many variables and on contact with diverse economic partners. I'd like to spend a little bit of time developing how the primary and secondary circulation relate to one another. Again, I'll use models that could apply in different ways, and we'll try to stress some of the potential variations as I go along. So first is a situation in which the monetary medium was so small and so high in value that it had precious little circulation outside the elite, meaning that there would be hardly any progression of coin beyond primary circulation. Those without close access to the milieu of monetary production would have used coin very rarely, if at all. Systems of this limited form would have been encountered most often in the period of dominance by gold, when finds of coin are few and generally suggestive of elite contexts. There would still have been some coin-based commerce for luxuries or in bulk, but other kinds of use would have played a relatively larger role in the circulation of coin. So gift giving, the payment of fines and taxes, and so forth. Importantly, larger state structures that involved but were still partially distinct from elite networks would have been a factor in the making and initial circulation of coin. Visigothic Iberia is one example of a system probably like this in practice. Its gold tremisses are usually viewed in the context of taxes being paid in and out of state coffers, though in fact it is difficult to be sure just how large a part fiscal action really played. The coins themselves give little away, while fines point to a situation in which the currency was not being completely replaced on a frequent basis, as might be expected if the tax system was truly dominant. So even if tax and expenditure did play a relatively larger role, and for longer than in Merovingian Gaul, for example, it should not be seen as accounting for the totality of circulation. Iberia also brings up an important point in relation to this taxonomy of early medieval coin circulation, which is that it applies best to new high-value coins of gold and silver. These were normally the dominant element in the coinage, though not necessarily the only part. There were tiny fractional silver coins in early Merovingian Gaul and in Lombard North Italy. In Visigothic Iberia, there was an interesting series of small bronze issues from several large eastern cities. These provided a parallel world of low-value currency that may have persisted into the later 7th century in some cases. Even more widespread was reuse of old Roman bronze coins. A revealing site in Spain is El Tolmo de Minateda, near Albacete. This Roman hilltop settlement was abandoned in the 2nd century, then reoccupied between the 6th and 9th centuries. Large-scale excavations on the site have yielded a large number of coins from the early medieval layers. These include a few Visigothic gold pieces, which occurred in the vicinity of the palace and basilica, but there were far more Roman bronze pieces, and these dated mostly to the 3rd or 4th century, and crucially this came after Roman period activity had actually ceased on this site. In other words, someone elsewhere in the early Middle Ages had found these old coins and brought them to El Tolmo de Minateda. On this hill in eastern Spain, there was a parallel world of low-value recycled coin that ran right through the early Middle Ages. Excavations of other sites in France and Italy have also identified prolonged circulation of Roman base metal coins, widely into the 7th century and sometimes into the 11th century. Some of these later finds of Roman bronzes have been read as raw material for metal workers, though this is not always clear, and in any case does not preclude a second chance circulation beforehand. It is distinctly possible that the lack of fresh low-value coin was met with prolonged recycling of earlier currency, undercutting some of the limitations of early medieval coined money. But I would stress that this was an informal practice and probably rare after about 600. Moreover, it still begs the question of cui bono. Someone has to have dug up the relevant coins at some point. They cannot have been in continuous circulation. And as rights to treasure typically went with land, access to Roman coins over time probably went more into the hands of landowners. Now, my second model for coin circulation is one in which minting and primary circulation remain the domain of the elite, but now with a wider reach of secondary circulation, though this too would probably still only go a few steps beyond elite-led channels. That is to say, there was more coin and more use of it, just not really a larger autonomous sphere of secondary monetary circulation. Commercial use would be more significant than in the first model and may have amounted to about the same of other uses put together. Carolingian Italy is a good example, not least because it illustrates how neighbouring regions, even within the same extended polity, could have quite different experiences. Italy at this time remains something of a puzzle. It had mint places turning out silver coins from 781 onwards, but there is a big difference between the fairly large representation of Italian coins outside the peninsula and the still meagre finds from within Italy. Simon Coupland and Alessia Rovelli are only the most recent of many scholars to look at this problem. Is the profile of finds from Italy representative? Not compared to England or the Netherlands, where there are big databases and relatively relaxed laws on metal detecting, but the difference compared to the similarly restrictive regime in France is also substantial. I suspect there is rather more coming to light in Italy than ever gets recorded, but even so, there does seem to be a genuine break here. Coin just didn't percolate out into local society in central and northern Italy as it did in some other parts of the Carolingian world, or in contemporary England. This scenario reverses the usual expectation that local networks of exchange would be the basis of coin use. Within Italy, it is possible that patterns of local use remained based on those of the earlier gold period, with very little coin use, while long-distance ones, in an empire that used silver denarii, took on a larger role. It therefore makes sense to look to mechanisms that would remove coin in bulk from Italy and then parachute it into circulation at distant places beyond the Alps. That might well include merchants engaged in long-distance commerce, but also aristocrats and ecclesiastical houses with landed interests in Italy. In any case, this example shows two things. One is a good case study of the middling second model with some secondary circulation, but still in a framework dictated by those responsible for primary circulation. Second, it shows how important it is to allow for distinct characteristics of individual regions or periods. My third and final model for early medieval monetization sees the secondary sphere of circulation clearly eclipse the primary one. Uses of coin beyond their initial contexts of production would be extensive and distanced enough to create a distinct autonomous sphere. One good clue to a network of exchange on this scale is when references occur to monetized exchange between two non-elite figures, as for instance in a 9th century miracle collection relating to the shrine of Saint Philibert at Noirmoutier in France. This describes how a throng of peasants would come for the holiness but stay for the market, in which one peasant went to a tavern and asked for a halfpenny's worth of wine from the landlord, though he only had a full penny with which to pay. Flustered by the busy conditions, the landlord inadvertently gave the man a full penny's worth of wine plus a halfpenny in change. He realized his mistake when the peasant came up for another round, saying, "You must be having a laugh, mate. What you've got there is mine, not yours, as you took away both my wine and my money." The peasant swore by Saint Philibert that he was in the right, and the offended saint inflicted prompt and messy retribution by having the peasant vomit all over the floor. Even in a society that ran on this model of monetization, primary circulation still mattered as the point of entry for everything that followed. And generally, it was still in elite hands, albeit a wider cross-section of the elite than before. Expanding coin use across much of Western Europe from the late 10th century into the 11th accompanied growth of the minting network, not really to handle demand from below, for most of the new mints were small and did not contribute much to the overall circulating medium. Instead, they enabled local elites to tap into a new way of expressing superiority in local society. Some of the English and West Frankish makers of coin at this stage were drawn from lower ranks of the elite, milites in France and thanes in England, or their peers in wealth and status. But the headline point is that there would now be a significantly larger layer of peasant coin use. And peasant here meant everyone, servile and free. It can be seen from texts like polyptychs, estate surveys, and anecdotes in miracle collections that show peasants paying cash for their rent and using markets to obtain the coins they needed to do so. Technically, these three models could all work with similar volumes of coin, for we are talking more about nature and intensity of use, but in practice they generally correlated with expansion of the currency, visible from coin finds that mount up in number and spread out into the countryside. Interestingly, early medieval coins still tend not to turn up in settlement excavations from this period, but rather from the land around them. A fourth model, not really seen anywhere in early medieval Western Europe, is when coin finds become commonplace in settlement excavations, suggesting frequent transactions within and between peasant households. This had happened in the Roman period and only occurs again in Western Europe after at least 1200. In our period, we should probably imagine coins being available to peasants, even kept in their homes, but only changing hands and therefore standing a higher chance of being lost in other settings, potentially more public ones like assemblies, markets, or rent payments, an argument that's recently been put forward by Thibaut Cardon in a French context and a bit further back by Chris Dyer for England. It is worth stressing that there was room for variation in how monetization implied by these models might work. Significant expansion would generally involve a commercial element. Written texts are clear on this, and it is difficult to see how wider distribution and reuse would be achieved otherwise, at least based on the information that we have. This is an important point. Coins may not have called a complex market economy into being, but they did act like fingerprint powder for one, and probably helped stimulate them to some degree, and yet they did not necessarily last. It might help to juxtapose here a last pair of examples. England in the age of bead from about 670 to 750, and then England in the late 10th and 11th centuries. On the face of it, going purely by the numbers on EMC and PAS, the earlier of these two was much more monetized in that there are just a great many more coin finds, and relative to the population, England in about 700 may have been as monetized as at any point down to the 17th century. But it is difficult to accept that there really was a commensurately larger, more articulated market economy at that time. The evidence from all sorts of historical and archaeological areas is much richer for the late 10th century and the 11th century, when the rise of coin use can be tied into the caging of the peasantry and the growth both of the lordly class and of seigneurial pressures on the rest of society. We seem instead to be looking at a relatively short burst of enhanced monetization in the late 7th century, precipitated by a change in how elites handled and disposed of their precious metal wealth. This led to a short-term deluge of silver coin, which was apparently pumped downwards socially. There are precious few coin hoards of this period from England, or indeed from France or the Netherlands, hinting at circulation that favoured small-scale use and not one in which coins served a major role as a store of wealth. This might be a monetary system that ticks all the boxes of my third most developed model, and it shows that societies of this period could absorb significant injections of cash, but in this case it was simply not as well embedded and supported as some later instances. I will wrap up there. The take-home point should be that although early medieval coined money was scarce and difficult to handle, it was nonetheless a lasting feature of the social and economic landscape, meaning that people did choose to make it and use it. I have tried to sketch out some of the reasons why they did so, and the effects of introducing coin into any transaction. Does all of this amount to a monetary economy? I would argue that yes, it did, one that worked in layers. Did everyone use cash as standard? Definitely no, although sometimes a more resounding no than as others. Did a wide range of people use cash from time to time? Definitely yes, with a lot of interest in when and why they did so. Did most people think in terms of monetary units for exchange purposes? Again, a resounding yes. I'm reluctant to participate in the game of drawing arbitrary lines in the historical sand for what point or variable constituted a real monetary economy. A better approach is to allow for different kinds of money economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very interesting talk, Rory. I, for one, loved it, and I have some questions myself. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and I will ask Rory your questions on your behalf. I have also just posted a link in the chat, which is a survey which will help shape future talks provided by the Money and Metals Network. So please do fill that out as well. So to kick things off, I have a few questions. I'm not a medievalist. I study ancient coinage. But I was struck by sort of how decentralized coinage production was under the Merovingians.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, were weights and the metal fineness sort of standardized throughout? Were people maintaining the same quality of coin, and these coins were being used everywhere throughout the empire? Or were there differences, or did people just not care?
The weight is mostly quite consistent. The fineness is very difficult to say for sure. It changes a lot over the period, and very broadly speaking, it goes downward over time. But you can also see that there are many examples of hoards where you have some very fine coins next to ones that are not so fine, and this suggests that there's probably a degree of fluctuation in the fineness. And also, this was not the only criterion that people used when they were judging their coins, that, you know, a good coin could be 60% pure or 80% pure. You wouldn't necessarily be too bothered by that. And yes, you're quite right that the fact that these coins could mingle together says that on the one hand, it's a system that has a lot of diversity in it, but it also suggests it's a system that's got effective and wide tolerance for those irregularities. To my mind, it suggests that the kings are just relatively open to people producing their own coins in their own way to a high degree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. It's very interesting because my point of comparison, of course, would be the late Roman period where they're producing the awful barbarian radiates, which, you know, they had their use, but the reason we have so many is, of course, because at some point they didn't have a use for them anymore, and that's why we always find so many. My other question is about when new coins were produced to replace old coins. Like when these new coins were produced, were they produced on a decentralized basis? And did we see any change in the coinage itself? So is it just a change in the money's name, or a continuation of the type, or are we seeing quite drastic changes in the coinage?
It varies a lot depending on where you are. And the question is, well, in effect, why are they doing this? You know, and I'd say that very often they do just carry on, and it looks like the coins are there to partly replace old ones. Although in many cases you can see that some older coins carry on being used for decades, centuries in some cases, which suggests to me that it's not just a matter of replacement, it's a matter of adding to the currency when you need some more coin. And so I think that's probably the driving concern in most cases. There are some examples where a king says, right, we're all going to change our coin to this new type now, but that's actually not the norm. In most cases, it's a more gradual accretion of new coins. And you can see this even in the late Roman period, you know, that hoards won't all be coins of, you know, Valentinian III or whoever. There'll be coins of several emperors with some from the latest one, and then a tail going back into previous reigns. The early Middle Ages are mostly like that. The exceptions are the Carolingian Empire in the late 8th, part of the 9th century, and then England in the late 10th, going on to the 11th century. So broadly speaking, I'd say that changes are simply part and parcel of making new coins, and you would make those for a whole host of reasons.
Yeah, it seems very similar to what I've found in the Roman provinces, like with the Mint of Tarsus. Like they seem to have maintained the usage of older coins and
Mm.
only produce new ones as necessary. And the newer productions are always less frequent than the older ones in terms of findings. So it's quite interesting that seems to
Yeah.
be quite consistent across history
Mm.
in terms of
Yeah, that is.
monetization.
I should say there's also sometimes a difference between different levels of the currency. So higher value coins are sometimes treated differently to low value ones. So thinking of particularly in the Mediterranean, bronze coins will sometimes carry on circulating for ages and ages, whereas gold and silver is more likely to be replaced.
Yes, yes, and we definitely see that with coin like late silver Roman coin hoards of like Gordian the Third, for
Yeah.
instance. Those silver coins disappeared very, very quickly from circulation as the currency was debased.
Mm.
My final question is where were these decentralized mints obtaining the metal from? Are they just using old coins and melting them down and restriking, or where are they getting the material from to produce a new currency?
That's an extremely good question. And in most cases, the short answer is we don't know for sure. I suspect that in most instances, the answer is probably a number of sources. They weren't calling on any one resource exclusively. Um, what we can say in most situations in early medieval Europe is that they're not local sources. There isn't any major source of gold within Western Europe, so they're clearly using something from elsewhere. And the theory is probably they're using mostly Byzantine, East Roman gold, probably originally in the form of coin, which is brought in. It may well have been melted down into something else first and then turned into coin. We don't know for sure. Later on, when they switched to silver, there are some silver mines in Western Europe. There's one in Western France, a place called Mel. There's several in Germany, but particularly in the Harz Mountains, there's a major cluster of silver mines. But these don't come online immediately. Mel only becomes important in the late 8th century. The Harz Mountains only in the 10th century. We can tell that we can tell from looking at lead isotopes and trace elements that in fact it's probably East Mediterranean silver again that they're using as the basis for this explosion of coined money that takes place in England in the late 7th century. So it's stuff that's been brought over from a long distance, probably then sits around in England in some other form, not coins, but presumably plates and other things, and then they decide to melt it down and turn it into coin in the late 7th and early 8th centuries.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I know in like the I believe it's like the Viking period and even later on, people were discovering hoards, and I know that Kevin Butcher recently did a talking about the continued use of currency and how even I think in the 18th century,
Yeah.
some people were still using Roman coins,
Mm. Yeah.
depending on where you were. And so I wonder as well if people must, well, I think you even touched on it in your talk about finding hoards and or finding coins and reusing those coins. So no, it's very interesting. We
Yeah.
only have a few minutes left in the slot. If you have any questions, anybody, please post them in the chat. If I don't see any, well, then I'll have to thank Professor Naismith again for the fantastic talk. Um, it was something I personally very, very much enjoyed. It seems very similar to my own work in the ancient world. So yeah, I still have many, many questions. I could go on. Okay, well, I guess with that, thank you again, and
That's quite
I
all
will
right.
end the call now.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Hope everyone liked it.